There comes a point in every engineering problem when mathematics stops negotiating. More armor means more weight. More weight demands a larger engine. A larger engine requires a larger hull. A larger hull becomes an easier target, costs more to build, and takes longer to produce. Every answer creates another problem until the numbers themselves begin saying no. By the middle of the 1930s, many British engineers believed they had reached that point. The British Army wanted a tank that could survive the latest anti-tank guns, carry a proper three-man turret, mount an effective main gun, and remain reliable enough for mass production before another European war arrived. Each requirement sounded reasonable on its own. Together they described a machine many believed Britain simply could not build. Among the doubters stood Leslie Little, chief designer at Vickers Armstrongs. Looking at the proposed specification, he saw an engineering trap that no amount of optimism could solve. Protection demanded weight. Weight demanded power. Power demanded size. Size demanded more steel, more money, and more factory time. Britain could certainly build another tank. Building one that ignored those limits appeared to be asking industry to defeat mathematics itself. The criticism came from every direction. Some officers believed speed would decide the next war. Others argued that aircraft would destroy slow armor before it ever reached the battlefield. Heavy breakthrough tanks, they insisted, belonged to the trenches of the First World War, not the faster campaigns everyone expected to come. The reasoning changed. The conclusion did not. The limit had been accepted. Albert Gerald Stern refused to accept it. At 58 years old, Stern carried both experience and unfinished business. He was not the chief engineer who would draw the Matilda II, nor would he supervise every calculation that transformed doctrine into steel. His influence reached the project in a different way. During the First World War, he had helped organize Britain's earliest tank programs, watching entirely new machines crawl across battlefields where years of conventional warfare had failed. When the war ended, governments abandoned many of those lessons almost overnight. Projects disappeared, orders vanished, budgets collapsed. To Stern, peace had not proved heavy tanks unnecessary. It had simply removed the urgency to build them. For nearly 20 years, he watched military thinking drift towards speed while he defended a different belief. A tank destroyed by the first anti-tank shell accomplished nothing, no matter how quickly it arrived. Survival came first. Every other advantage depended upon it. That belief slowly became unfashionable. Younger officers embraced fast cruiser tanks designed to exploit breakthroughs across open country. Politicians preferred lighter vehicles that appeared cheaper and easier to produce. Newspapers admired speed because speed looked modern. Stern continued arguing that infantry could never outrun artillery or machine gun fire. If tanks existed to protect advancing soldiers, then protection could never become an afterthought. Every year that argument survived, it became more difficult to defend. If the next war proved him wrong, history would remember him as the man who had spent 2 decades defending yesterday's battlefield. If it proved him right, the critics who had dismissed him would have to explain why Britain's oldest idea had survived its newest war. The British Army eventually chose not between the competing philosophies, but alongside them. During the mid-1930s, it divided future tanks into 2 distinct families. Cruiser tanks would move quickly after enemy lines had been broken. Infantry tanks would create those breakthroughs by advancing beside soldiers on foot, while absorbing punishment that lighter vehicles could not survive. The decision sounded administrative. It changed everything. In 1936, the Army issued a requirement known simply as A-12. Outside military offices, the designation meant almost nothing. Inside British engineering circles, it represented one of the most demanding armored vehicle specifications the country had attempted before the Second World War. The future tank required a fully rotating 3-man turret, a QF 2-pounder gun, armor thick enough to resist contemporary anti-tank weapons, and reliability suitable for wartime production. It did not ask engineers to find a comfortable balance. It asked them to favor protection above almost everything else. The detailed design belonged to the engineers at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, whose task was to transform military doctrine into measurable dimensions, armor layouts, suspension geometry, and production drawings. Yet every major decision echoed the argument Albert Stern had defended for years. If an infantry tank existed to survive direct fire while supporting soldiers on foot, then armor could not become negotiable simply because it complicated the engineering. The mathematics offered no sympathy. Every increase in armor thickness added weight. Greater weight demanded stronger suspension. Stronger suspension added more weight. More weight required more engine power. Larger engines demanded more space, more fuel, and more structural reinforcement. Every calculation pushed the designers back toward the same uncomfortable question: How much could they sacrifice before the tank stopped being the machine the army had asked for? Stern followed the project's progress closely because it represented far more than another army contract. It represented the strongest test his ideas had ever faced. If the design succeeded, it would prove that 20 years of criticism had overlooked something fundamental about battlefield survival. If it failed, every officer who had dismissed the infantry tank would finally possess the evidence they had been waiting for. The pressure was deeply personal. Inside the Royal Arsenal, engineers searched for solutions that preserved the specification without asking British industry for miracles. They could not simply remove armor because armor defined the vehicle's purpose. They could not install an engine that did not exist. Every compromise had to protect the central idea while remaining practical enough to build before war arrived. Their answer revealed just how narrow the engineering margin had become. Instead of relying upon a purpose-built, high-performance engine, the designers selected two commercial AEC diesel bus engines working together. One engine alone could not move the weight. Two produced enough power to keep the tank advancing, although never quickly. The arrangement complicated maintenance, but it preserved the armor that justified the entire project. When Stern learned how the engineers intended to solve the problem, he did not celebrate the speed they had sacrificed. He looked at the protection they had preserved. Every drawing placed upon the table carried more than another engineering solution. It carried Albert Stern's last chance to prove that he had not spent 20 years defending the wrong future. The finished design approached 27 tons and carried frontal armor approaching 78 millimeters in thickness, making it one of the most heavily protected tanks anywhere in the world when it entered production. Against many anti-tank guns then entering service, those figures promised something unusual, not invincibility, time. Enough time for infantry to keep moving, enough time for crews to keep fighting, enough time to discover whether Albert Stern had understood the future better than the men who believed the age of heavy armor had already come to an end. The blueprints were finished, the arguments were over, the battlefield would deliver the verdict. The first Matilda II rolled out of the factory carrying far more than steel, rivets, and machinery. It carried Albert Stern's reputation into a war that would judge ideas far more harshly than any committee ever could. Once production began, arguments lost their value. Engineers no longer defended calculations, crews would defend them in battle. The Matilda entered service as Britain's newest infantry tank, a term that shaped every decision hidden beneath its armor. Unlike a cruiser tank, which was designed to exploit breakthroughs with speed, an infantry tank existed to create those breakthroughs by advancing alongside soldiers on foot. It would absorb fire that ordinary infantry could not survive, crush fortified positions, and keep moving when lighter vehicles were forced to stop. The philosophy demanded sacrifice before the first shot was ever fired. Speed became secondary, protection became everything. Stern had spent 2 decades arguing that this was exactly the order it should be. If the armor had to become so heavy that speed disappeared, then speed would simply have to be sacrificed. Turning that philosophy into a machine required engineers to solve problems that had no perfect solution. The 3-man turret provided enough space for a commander, gunner, and loader to perform separate jobs instead of forcing one exhausted man to do several at once. The QF 2-pounder, Britain's standard 40mm anti-tank gun at the beginning of the war, offered enough firepower to defeat contemporary enemy armor, but fitting the weapon inside a heavily protected turret left very little room for future expansion. Beneath the hull, the bell crank suspension, a system of pivoting arms that distributed the enormous weight across multiple road wheels, prevented the tank from destroying itself whenever it crossed rough ground. None of these systems attracted newspaper headlines, yet each represented an engineering compromise that allowed the armor to remain where Stern believed it belonged. Every kilogram saved inside the vehicle became another kilogram that could remain protecting the crew. The factories faced challenges just as demanding as the designers. The Royal Arsenal could produce drawings. Vulcan Foundry had to transform those drawings into hundreds of identical machines, while Britain raced toward a war that seemed increasingly unavoidable. Thick armor demanded precision machining. Precision demanded time. Every completed hull required inspection because small manufacturing errors that appeared insignificant inside the factory could become fatal once enemy shells began striking the vehicle in combat. Production moved steadily, but never quickly. Critics pointed toward the slow output as proof that heavily armored infantry tanks asked too much from British industry. Stern saw the delays differently. He believed difficult engineering did not become wrong simply because it demanded patience. Every completed Matilda represented another chance to prove that survival on the battlefield justified the effort inside the factory. Then the war accelerated beyond everyone's expectations. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. 8 months later, German armored divisions swept through Belgium and France with astonishing speed, combining tanks, aircraft, artillery, and radio communication into an offensive that stunned much of Europe. Newspapers quickly celebrated Blitzkrieg as though speed itself had become the decisive weapon of modern warfare. Against that backdrop, the Matilda appeared strangely old-fashioned. It weighed almost 27 tons, yet struggled to exceed 15 miles per hour on roads and considerably less across broken ground. Faster German vehicles seemed to embody the future that many officers had predicted years earlier. Once again, Albert Stern watched the debate begin turning against him. He had heard the arguments before. This time, however, the battlefield would answer them instead of the newspapers. That answer arrived near the French town of Arras on 21 May 1940. British and French forces launched a counterattack against advancing German formations in an effort to disrupt the offensive racing toward the English Channel. Compared with later battles, Arras involved relatively modest numbers of tanks. Its significance came from what happened after the firing began. German anti-tank crews opened fire with their standard 37mm PaK-36 guns, weapons that had performed well against most contemporary armored vehicles. The first rounds struck the Matilda's armor. The tank kept moving. More shells followed. Again the armor held. Some rounds chipped the surface. Others ricocheted away entirely. Crews who expected another routine engagement suddenly faced a machine that refused to behave according to the calculations they trusted. German soldiers would later refer to the PaK-36 with the mocking nickname Herrenklopfgerät, the army door knocker, because against heavily armored targets, it often seemed to accomplish little more than knocking on the front door. The engagement at Arras did not stop Germany's campaign through France. Operational momentum remained firmly in German hands, and the British Expeditionary Force would soon withdraw toward Dunkirk. Yet the battle accomplished something far more important for Albert Stern's argument than any local tactical success. It produced evidence, reports describing British tanks surviving repeated hits from Germany's standard anti-tank gun moved rapidly through German headquarters. Officers compared battlefield accounts with technical specifications and discovered that both could be true at the same time. The weapon had performed exactly as designed. The Matilda simply exceeded the assumptions on which the weapon had been built. Back in Britain, Stern followed those reports with quiet satisfaction. Every shell that failed to penetrate the Matilda's armor proved something larger than the success of a single tank. It proved that he might not have spent 20 years defending yesterday's battlefield after all. France collapsed only weeks later, and with it came another moment where the story seemed ready to end. Thousands of British soldiers escaped across the English Channel from Dunkirk, while much of their equipment remained behind. To many observers, the Matilda looked like another promising machine overtaken by events beyond its control. Building the tank had solved the engineering problem. It had not yet answered whether the engineers had solved the right one. That answer would not arrive in Europe. It would emerge beneath a very different sky, across the deserts of North Africa, where the Matilda would encounter an enemy who had learned from France but had not yet discovered how to defeat the argument hidden beneath nearly 3 inches of British armor. North Africa transformed the war into a different kind of engineering test. The narrow roads and crowded hedgerows of France disappeared, replaced by open desert where the horizon stretched for miles, and concealment became almost impossible. Every vehicle could be seen long before it arrived. Every advance depended upon fuel, water, spare parts, and supply columns traveling across enormous distances. Mobility still mattered, but the desert rewarded something else as well. It rewarded machines that could continue moving after the enemy had already opened fire. The Matilda entered this new battlefield carrying the same strengths and weaknesses it had displayed in France. It was still slow. It was still difficult to manufacture. It still forced mechanics to maintain 2 diesel engines instead of 1. None of those compromises had changed. What changed was the enemy standing in front of it. Italian anti-tank guns closely resembled many of the weapons the Matilda had already faced during the fighting in France, and they reached much the same conclusion. Shells struck the thick British armor with little visible effect. Defensive positions designed to stop ordinary tanks suddenly found themselves confronting a machine that simply refused to disappear. Albert Stern followed these reports with growing confidence because every battlefield confirmed the same principle he had defended for decades. Armor was not making the Matilda invincible. It was buying the crew something far more valuable. Time to return fire, time to reach the objective, time for the infantry advancing behind it to survive ground they otherwise could not have crossed. Late in 1940, Britain launched Operation Compass, an offensive originally planned as a limited raid against Italian forces in Egypt. It quickly became one of the most successful campaigns of the early war. Instead of ending after a few days, British forces continued advancing, capturing fortified positions, supply depots, and tens of thousands of prisoners as the Italian 10th Army collapsed under the pressure. At the center of many of those attacks stood the Matilda II. Its deliberate pace no longer appeared to be its greatest weakness because the battlefield demanded something different. British commanders did not ask the Matilda to race across the desert. They asked it to break defensive lines that lighter vehicles could not penetrate. At Bardia, a heavily fortified Italian stronghold prepared over many months, anti-tank guns and concrete positions were expected to slow any assault long enough for artillery to destroy it. Instead, the Matildas continued forward under sustained fire. Shell after shell struck the armor. The tanks kept moving. Infantry followed close behind, using the advancing armor as moving protection across ground that would otherwise have become a killing field. The battle demonstrated precisely what Stern had argued since the First World War. A tank that survived the first shot often survived long enough to complete its mission. Success at Bardia carried the offensive westward toward Tobruk, another fortified port whose capture would transform Britain's position in North Africa. Once again, the Matilda appeared wherever resistance seemed strongest. Commanders trusted it because they understood exactly what it could and could not do. It would never outrun a fast cruiser tank. It would never perform sweeping maneuvers across open country. It would, however, continue advancing through fire that stopped other vehicles. Reliability often matters more than brilliance in war, and by early 1941, the Matilda had become one of the most reliable tools available to British commanders. Each successful assault strengthened Albert Stern's position, even though he stood hundreds of miles away from the battlefield. Every report arriving in Britain told the same story from a different location. The critics had predicted that heavy armor belonged to the past. The battlefield was delivering a different verdict. Each shell that failed to penetrate the Matilda's armor proved something larger than the success of a single tank. It proved that Stern might not have spent 20 years defending yesterday's war after all. As British forces continued their advance, those reports reached another audience. German officers arriving in North Africa to support their Italian allies inherited battlefield accounts that sounded increasingly difficult to dismiss. Similar stories had already emerged from France after Arras. Now the same descriptions arrived from the desert. Standard anti-tank guns were failing against Britain's heavily armored infantry tank. German commanders examined the reports carefully because they challenged assumptions upon which much of their anti-tank doctrine had been built. When elements of the Afrika Korps first encountered the Matilda, they discovered that the reports had not exaggerated the problem. Their 37mm Pak 36, Germany's standard anti-tank gun at the beginning of the war, struggled to penetrate the Matilda's frontal armor except under unusually favorable conditions. Crews searched desperately for side shots. Others waited until the British tanks came dangerously close. Even then, success remained uncertain. A weapon trusted throughout the opening campaigns of the war had suddenly become inadequate against one particular opponent. The Matilda had not merely survived German fire, it had exposed a weakness in German planning. By February 1941, the campaign reached Beta Fomme, where retreating Italian forces attempted one final escape before British troops closed the trap. The victory completed one of the most remarkable offensives of the early war and destroyed much of the Italian 10th Army as an effective fighting force. It also created a dangerous new question inside German headquarters. Until that point, commanders had treated the Matilda as a difficult battlefield problem that could perhaps be solved through better positioning or improved tactics. Beta Fomme suggested the problem ran much deeper. Germany no longer needed to ask whether the Matilda could survive. It already knew the answer. The question had become far more urgent. How could it be stopped? Everything so far had measured what the Matilda could endure. The rest of the story would measure what it could not. The first response was not a new tank. It was a new way of using weapons that already existed. German commanders accepted that continuing to rely upon the Pak 36 alone would simply produce more failures, so they turned to a gun that had never been designed to hunt tanks in the first place. The 88mm Flak gun had entered service as a high-altitude anti-aircraft weapon built to destroy bombers rather than armored vehicles. It possessed tremendous muzzle velocity, excellent range, and enough penetrating power to solve a problem that ordinary anti-tank guns no longer could. When properly positioned, the gun punched through armor that had previously appeared untouchable. The solution worked, but it came with obvious disadvantages. An 88 required a large crew, careful preparation, and time to deploy. It could not simply accompany advancing infantry the way a dedicated anti-tank gun could. Yet necessity outweighed doctrine. German commanders increasingly positioned the great anti-aircraft gun across likely avenues of attack because the battlefield had taught them something their manuals had not. The Matilda had forced one of the most experienced armies in Europe to abandon old assumptions. Albert Stern's gamble had done more than produce a successful tank. It had compelled an enemy to change the way it fought. That adaptation marked only the beginning. Once German officers understood why their guns were failing, the problem stopped being tactical and became educational. Reports from Arras were compared with reports from Operation Compass. Armor thickness, engagement distances, firing angles, ammunition performance, and battlefield observations moved through headquarters where engineers and planners searched for patterns rather than isolated incidents. The Matilda was no longer treated as an unusual British curiosity. It had become a measurable engineering problem demanding a systematic solution. The campaigns in North Africa became the classroom in which Germany rewrote its anti-tank doctrine. Crews received new instructions. Reconnaissance became more important because identifying Matilda formations early allowed heavier weapons to occupy favorable positions before the fighting began. Artillery coordination improved. Anti-aircraft units found themselves permanently integrated into ground operations whenever heavily armored British tanks were expected. Back in Britain, Stern understood exactly what those changes meant. His philosophy had won its argument on the battlefield. Now the battlefield was preparing its reply. Understanding changed tactics. Industry changed the future. German engineers no longer sought merely to defeat the Matilda. They began designing weapons capable of defeating the generation of tanks that would inevitably follow it. Longer-barrel anti-tank guns entered production because greater muzzle velocity translated directly into greater armor penetration. The 50mm Pak-38 gradually replaced the older Pak-36, and more powerful 75mm guns soon followed as the war accelerated beyond the assumptions of 1939. Germany was no longer borrowing an anti-aircraft gun to solve an emergency. It was building a new family of weapons around the lessons the Matilda had forced it to learn. The factory had answered the battlefield. Every improvement carried one clear message: armor alone would never remain enough forever. Britain faced a different problem because the Matilda itself had very little room left to grow. The thick armor that had made it so formidable consumed the weight, space, and engineering margin needed for future improvements. Designers explored ways to increase its firepower, but each proposal returned to the same obstacle. A larger gun required a larger breech. A larger breech required a larger turret. A larger turret increased weight. Greater weight demanded stronger suspension and more engine power. The same chain of compromises that had troubled Leslie Little before the first prototype now returned with even greater force. The Matilda had been engineered so closely around its original mission that changing one major component threatened every other system inside the vehicle. Albert Stern had always accepted that heavy protection demanded sacrifice. He now faced the cost of that decision. The armor that had carried the Matilda safely through the opening years of the war had left no practical room for the larger gun the changing battlefield now demanded, and the choice that once made the tank almost impossible to stop had become the very reason it struggled to keep pace with the war evolving around it. The change happened gradually rather than in one dramatic battle. The Matilda did not become obsolete overnight, nor did crews suddenly lose faith in the machine that had protected them so well. It remained dependable, mechanically robust, and respected by the men who fought inside it. In many situations, its armor still offered valuable protection. Yet wars rarely pause while successful designs catch up. Every month that passed introduced stronger anti-tank guns, better ammunition, and opponents who understood exactly where the Matilda's strengths ended. Britain increasingly shifted its attention toward newer vehicles that offered greater development potential. The Churchill inherited much of the infantry tank philosophy that Stern had defended for decades, especially the belief that protection remained essential for supporting infantry through heavily defended positions. This time, however, designers worked harder to preserve room for future growth because the Matilda had demonstrated the danger of building too close to the engineering limits. As heavier guns appeared across the battlefield, the question was no longer whether the Matilda could survive. It was whether Albert Stern's lifelong argument had reached its limit. The answer was more complicated than either side of the original debate expected. Stern had been correct that armor could dominate a battlefield when opposing weapons were not prepared for it. His critics had also been correct that excessive emphasis on protection could restrict future development once the battlefield adapted. The Matilda had not proved one philosophy entirely right and the other entirely wrong. It had revealed that engineering victories are temporary, because every successful machine forces an opponent to invent something better. The battlefield never stops learning. By the middle of the war, the Matilda gradually disappeared from the front lines where newer tanks carried stronger guns, more powerful engines, and greater potential for future improvements. Its greatest victories already belonged to history, but its greatest lesson did not. Albert Stern watched later British designs continue wrestling with the same balance that had defined his career. Every tank still required engineers to decide how much protection justified the weight it imposed. Every increase in armor still demanded sacrifices somewhere else. Engines became stronger, metallurgy improved, suspension systems evolved, the mathematics remained unchanged. The machine eventually yielded, the argument did not. The Matilda II was never the fastest tank of its generation. It could not evolve as quickly as the war demanded. The armor that protected its crews also limited the weapon it could eventually carry, and the decision that made it extraordinary forced it aside when the battlefield changed. Those costs were paid by the soldiers who continued climbing inside the vehicle long after stronger guns had begun appearing across Europe and North Africa. Yet engineering is measured by more than longevity. Sometimes it is measured by whether one difficult decision exposes a flaw in accepted thinking. Albert Stern accepted every consequence that followed from placing protection ahead of speed because he believed survival itself could become a battlefield advantage. For a brief period in France and across the deserts of North Africa, that belief proved impossible to ignore. German anti-tank doctrine changed because of it. German industry changed because of it. Later, British tanks inherited part of it while avoiding the compromises that had constrained the Matilda. The story began with an impossibility. A tank could not become that heavily armored without sacrificing everything else. Most engineers accepted the limit. Albert Stern chose to cross it anyway. Steel became heavier. The battlefield became faster. His argument survived.